I'm Jamie Lockey. I think all of you pretty much know me, but I write short fiction. I've sold over 50 short stories to various online markets and print markets. I'm in the Science Fiction Adventist Writers of America, and I just published a short story collection that I funded through Kickstarter. So, that's me. This is my story. Protection from the darkness. Tommy found scraps at the bottom of a pile of frozen kittens. We heard them mewing under the porch, and Tommy slipped underneath the worn boards and pulled out the whole sad heap. I started crying when I saw them. They had huddled under our porch and piled together for warmth, and only the kitten in the middle had survived. If we'd heard them the night before, maybe we could have saved all of them. Tommy peeled away the twisted, frozen bodies until our kitten poked his tiny face out. His eyes were glued closed by thick yellow pus, and his orange and black fur stuck to his skin in matted patches. "Mom!" I shouted. "Come here!" Mom peered out through the screen door, her thin face shadowed by dark, tangled hair. "What is it, Dolly?" "I found a kitten," Tommy said, holding up the tiny body that nestled in his cupped hands. "His name is Scraps." Mom pressed a palm against the screen. For a second, I thought she was going to come out. She hadn't come outside since Dad died. That's when she changed, when she started doing the dark and twisted magic that made my skin crawl. Maybe, if she came outside, things would start to get better. She pulled her hand back. "Bring him in." Tommy scrambled through the screen door. I gathered up the other kittens to bury in the backyard. I couldn't get the shovel in the frozen ground, so I buried them in a snowdrift. The coyotes would probably get them, but at least I'd tried. I made breakfast while Tommy and Mom tended to Scraps. I made tea with bags I'd already used 3 times, spread butter and jam over burnt toast, and scraped underdone oatmeal into almost clean bowls. I wanted to be better at cooking, but Mom wouldn't teach me. I heated up the last of the milk for Scraps and took the trays to the spare bedroom, where Mom sang one of her weird songs over Scraps' tiny form. Tommy clutched Mom's hand and stared, his blue eyes almost as wide as the teacups that clattered in their saucers when I set them on the bed. The song sounded like the same one she'd sung when Tommy fell down the stairs and scraped his knee. I'd seen Tommy's knee get better. But the song didn't seem to be working on Scraps. He flinched away and tried to kiss. I washed Scraps with a warm cloth while Mom and Tommy ate their toast. The kitten's eyes cracked open. He stared up at me. One of his eyes was dark green, the other deep gold. They seemed too bright and wise and deep for kitten eyes. He grabbed my index finger in his toothless mouth, and my heart melted. When he let go, I dipped my finger in the saucer of warm milk and dripped some onto his pink tongue. Mom offered to take him back so I could eat, but I shook my head and kept dripping milk in Scraps' mouth. I hadn't saved his brothers and sisters, but maybe I could help him. He was Tommy's kitten. Tommy found him, after all. As soon as he was healthy enough, Scraps started following Tommy around all day. They kept each other out of trouble. Scraps avoided Mom, so Tommy started avoiding her too. At night, Scraps came to my bedroom, and he'd stay with me till dawn. He hated the night. I think it reminded him of the cold and how his brothers and sisters had all died around him while he survived. Even though Scraps loved Tommy, he didn't trust him to protect him from the darkness. That was my job. I was glad to do it, and sometimes, when I had a nightmare, Scraps would curl up on my chest and purr so hard he woke me up. It was like he was protecting me, too. It was nice to feel protected. Winter wore on, and Mom slipped farther and farther into her dark ways. She would go days without saying a single real word. She stopped eating. She still muttered in her weird not language, still sang creepy songs, but she'd turn her too thin face away from me when I'd ask if she would go to the store and buy milk. One day, she didn't get out of bed, and I had to go up to her room. I hated her room. Spiderweb shadows filled its corners, heavy curtains covered its windows, and the close, musty air smelled like dust and lavender. It made me sleepy. I was afraid to sleep in Mom's room. I pressed a mug of honeyed tea into her hand, and she stared at me with eyes that were almost black. They'd been blue before Dad died, before the healing magic spiraled out of her control. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Where's my husband?" I blinked back tears and told her to drink her tea. We started to get letters from the school about me and Tommy not attending. I wrote back that we were ill and forged my mother's signature. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't leave her alone, and I couldn't trust Tommy to keep his mouth shut. He thought Mom going crazy was cool. He liked her weird songs and her words that made no sense but sounded like the summer wind. Sometimes I liked them too, and that scared me even more than Mom's gaunt face and black eyes. And sometimes I caught myself listening, maybe understanding. I'd grab Scraps and drag Tommy outside and make snow angels. Our yard was covered with angels. The school sent a man to check on us. He was tall and thin and carried a briefcase. Mom heard his car turn into our drive, and she actually got out of bed to answer the door. At first, I thought maybe things would be okay. But when she saw him, she cried out in joy, "Henry!" She touched the man's arm. His eyes changed, the irises darkening into a black as deep as Mom's. His face changed, too. His pinched, cold expression broadened and warmed. Mom was right. This man was my father. I understood that it wasn't actually true, but she put something inside the man that made him resemble Dad, and I felt true. It seemed real. He swept my mother up and twirled her around. She laughed. "I missed you so much," she said. "Promise you'll never leave me again." "I promise," he said in my father's voice. They kissed. "Tommy, your father is home," Mom called. "Come give him a hug." Tommy barreled downstairs with Scraps at his heels and flung himself into the man's arms. "I knew you'd come back." The kitten froze in the doorway. The stranger smiled at me over Tommy's head. "I'd like to hug you too, Dolly." I wanted to feel his arms around me. I'd always felt safe in my father's embrace. Instead, I knelt and scooped Scraps into my arms. He buried his face against my neck. It helped me remember that what Mom was doing was wrong. Scraps mewed. "Shh, it's okay," I whispered. "Dolly?" The familiar note of sternness in my father's voice brought tears to my eyes. I refused to look. If I looked, I might start to really believe he was my father, not some stranger with a briefcase that my mother was doing something horrible to. "Mom, you can't do this," I said. I won't let you." Black eyes bored into me. "Don't be silly, Dolly. Give your father a hug." "It's okay, Peanut," he said. No one had called me that since he died. One of my feet moved forward on its own. I imagined Mom magicking up another Dolly, putting her in my body, a happy, hugging, fake Dolly. My other foot moved toward the man who wasn't my father. I focused on Scraps. "Help me," I whispered in a wobbly voice that didn't want to obey. Scraps looked at me. A tear rolled down my cheek and plopped onto his forehead. He blinked his mismatched eyes. His tiny claws gripped at my collar. He nibbled my finger harder than when we played. It hurt. My feet stopped moving. The man in the doorway didn't look like Dad anymore. We were both immune to her magic now. Scraps twisted out of my arms. He puffed up and hissed, then launched himself at the man who thought he was my father. The man backed away. Mom started to wail, a keening, inhuman sound. Tommy covered his ears and started crying. Scraps drove the man back another step, and he was out the door. The blackness faded from his eyes, and his face lost all traces of my father. He stared at the kitten and collapsed. Mom, still screaming, launched herself at Scraps. Her emaciated arms stretched, her face twisted into something inhuman. Fingernails glistened like talons. I threw myself in front of her. It was my job to protect Scraps from her darkness. Nails raked my cheek. I cried out, and the cuts burned. Scraps darted between my ankles and sank his teeth into Mom's leg. Her screams changed in pitch. She kicked Scraps off hard. He flew across the room, and Tommy caught him. Mom's screams wavered. I dared to hope. Maybe, since Scraps bit her, Mom would be immune now. Maybe she would come back. I edged closer. She raised her hand to strike, but slowly, as if she were underwater. Recognition and confusion struggled to claim her expression. Her scream faded to a steady hiss. I rushed in and wrapped my arms around her. She tried to pull away, but I wouldn't let her. Eventually, the anger in her transformed to sadness. She slumped in my arms. Her eyes swirled blue, then black again. I draped her on the couch and held her hand. The black took a long time to fade. Finally, Mom gazed at me through bright blue eyes that I remembered. Dolly? She touched the cuts on my cheek. What did I do? I squeezed her hand. It's over now. She fainted, and Scraps scrambled from Tommy's grip. Tommy looked at me. Daddy's gone for good now, isn't he? I nodded. I'm sorry, Tommy. He sniffled. Is Mommy gonna be normal again? I hope so. Tommy stared at the unconscious stranger on our porch. I hope so too. I emptied the stranger's wallet and sent Tommy to the store for fresh tea and milk. I figured Mom and the man from the school would want something warm when they woke up.